Margaret Holloway sat in a leather chair that cost more than her monthly rent, her hands folded in her lap, her mother's brown leather suitcase resting against her orthopedic shoes. The chair was the color of old money, the kind of chair that had witnessed 1,000 small deaths in this office. Across from her, Richard's lawyer, a man named Caldwell with silver cufflinks and a face like a marble bust, turned pages in a manila folder with the efficiency of someone processing inventory. It was a Tuesday in March. Outside the window behind Caldwell, downtown glistened with the sort of cruel sunshine that makes everything look sharper, cleaner, more defined. Margaret had worn her tortoiseshell reading glasses on a beaded chain, the faded lavender cardigan her daughter Suzanne had given her 10 years ago. And she had brushed her silver-white hair into a soft bun at the nape of her neck, the same style she'd worn for 35 years. These small choices had felt important this morning, as though looking put together might somehow inoculate her against what was coming. She had been married to Richard for 35 years, 35 years of mornings and evenings, of ordinary Tuesdays and extraordinary anniversaries, of his hand reaching for hers across a dinner table, of whispered promises in the dark. 35 years of becoming, gradually, and then all at once, the background music of his life. "The house," Caldwell said, reading from the document as though it were a grocery list, "remains the property of Richard James Holloway. The investment portfolio, valued at approximately $2.3 million, remains the property of Richard James Holloway. The vacation property in Kiowa Island." "I know," Margaret said quietly. Her voice had come out smaller than she intended. She cleared her throat. "I know about the properties." She had stopped fighting a month ago. Her own lawyer, a young woman named Patricia, who wore inexpensive jewelry and had kind eyes, had advised her to push for more. The house alone was worth nearly $1 million. She had managed that house for 35 years, chosen its colors, coordinated its renovations, hosted 43 dinner parties in the dining room, where Richard had announced his deals and his victories, and basked in the admiration of people Margaret had fed and complimented and remembered the names of their children. But Margaret had already spent $70,000 in legal fees. My Patricia had explained this with obvious frustration. Richard's lawyer was more aggressive. He would drag this out, she said. Margaret would lose more money. At her age, she needed to preserve what she had. Patricia had used the word "at your age" like it was a diagnosis. "The pension," Caldwell continued, "will be divided according to the Qualified Domestic Relations Order. Mrs. Holloway will receive 40%, effective immediately upon finalization. 40% of a pension Richard had earned while Margaret raised their 2 children, Derek and Suzanne, in a 4,000-square-foot house in the neighborhood, where the lawns were manicured and the secrets were deep. She had given up her career for this. She had been on the verge of something important. Research into information retention in pediatric populations, grant funding in place, a career that stretched before her like a golden path. And then, Richard had been offered the position at Meridian Development, the opportunity, the momentum, the promise that her sacrifice would mean something because they would build something together. "The personal property of the respondent remains with the respondent," Caldwell said. "Clothing, jewelry, and 1 storage unit. Ridgemont Self-Storage, Unit Number 7, rental prepaid through December 2030. The words seemed to fall into the room like pennies into a well, landing with a small, hollow sound that Margaret felt in her sternum. "Storage unit?" Margaret looked up at Caldwell's face. It was expressionless, the face of a man who had performed this transaction in so many forms that it had become a series of motions without weight. "I don't understand." "Richard didn't store anything. Richard..." The unit was rented by Helen Holloway, Caldwell said, consulting the document once more. That would be the respondent's mother. The rental has been prepaid in full. Apparently it contains her personal effects. The respondent did not wish to take possession of the unit or its contents. The court has assigned it to you as part of the settlement. Richard's mother, Helen, dead 14 years. A quiet Appalachian woman with weathered hands and the kind of wisdom that came from growing up in a holler in eastern Kentucky, where people understood that you saved what mattered and let go of everything else. Helen, who had died at 82, had been the only member of the Holloway family who had ever treated Margaret like she belonged there, like she was not a pleasant accessory, but a necessary person. Across the room, Richard sat in his own leather chair, and Margaret felt his presence before she looked at him. He was wearing a navy blazer and Italian leather loafers. His dark hair dyed the kind of black that didn't exist in nature. He had a golfer's tan, the sort of tan that came from years of expensive leisure. He was 69 years old and looked like a man who had never worried about money or time or the consequences of his choices. When their eyes met, he smiled. It was not a kind smile. It was the smile of someone who had already won and was merely watching the formalities play out. "The storage unit," Margaret heard herself say. "What's in it?" Caldwell glanced at Richard. Richard shrugged, a gesture of such casual dismissal that it felt like a slap. "Oh, my mother's junk," he said. His voice had the polished tone of a man used to being listened to. "She collected things, quilts mostly, some old furniture. It's been up there since she died. I was going to dispose of it when the rental expires. You can have it if you like. Save me the hassle." Margaret felt something shift in her chest, some small tectonic movement that she would spend years trying to understand. She had spent 35 years learning Richard's language, his preferences, his unspoken desires. She knew that his dismissal of Helen's things meant they were worthless to him, which meant they were less than worthless, which meant they were beneath his consideration. When Richard said something didn't matter, it ceased to exist in any meaningful way. But Helen mattered to Margaret. "I'll take the unit," Margaret said. She heard her own voice as if from a distance, "and a copy of the key." They finalized the details without ceremony. Caldwell slid a key across the mahogany desk, and Margaret picked it up. It was small and brass and warm from sitting under the lawyer's palm. The paperwork was signed. Margaret's signature small and careful, as though legibility might somehow grant her dignity in this exchange. When it was finished, Richard stood to leave. He did not look at his wife. He did not acknowledge the fact that they had shared a life, a bed, a mortgage, a dream that had curdled into something unrecognizable. He simply walked to the door in his expensive loafers and opened it, and somewhere behind him, Margaret heard the soft peal of a woman's laughter. Young laughter. The laughter of someone who was still ascending while Margaret was falling. The woman in the hallway was Vanessa. Margaret knew her name, had looked up her real estate listings online like a detective, had studied her photograph until she could see the parts of herself that Richard had traded away for. The younger skin, the brighter hair, the face of a woman who still had nothing behind her eyes, but reflected light. Margaret sat alone in the office for a moment after they left. She kept the key in her fist, feeling its shape bite into her palm. She did not cry. She had learned long ago that tears in public spaces were a luxury she could not afford. Instead, she stood, gathered her mother's leather suitcase, and walked to the elevator in the quiet way she had learned to move through the world since her marriage had ended. Invisible, apologetic, taking up as little space as possible. Outside, the spring sunlight was merciless. It showed every line on her face, every gray hair that had escaped the bun, every small indignity of age. She walked to her 10-year-old Honda Civic, paid for with her pension contributions, something that belonged only to her, and drove through the town she had lived in for 40 years but no longer recognized. The one-bedroom apartment was dark when she arrived. She had rented it 4 months ago, in the immediate aftermath of Richard's announcement that he wanted a divorce, that he had met someone, that he was sorry but not sorry, that life was short and he deserved to be happy. The apartment had beige walls and linoleum floors and a bathroom where the shower was clearly original to the building. It cost $1,800 a month. Her pension would be $40,000 a year once the division was finalized. $333 a month for food and utilities and medicine. She set the suitcase down on the bed. Her mother's suitcase, one of the few things Richard had allowed her to keep because he had never valued it, and walked to the kitchen. She filled a glass with tap water and stood at the window, looking out at the parking lot where her neighbor's laundry fluttered on a clothesline. Someone was learning to play saxophone across the hall. Someone else was coughing persistently behind a closed door. This was her life now. 71 years old, surrounded by strangers, in a room she paid for with money that would run out when she did. The key sat on the kitchen table where she had placed it, small and brass and humming with possibility. Ridgemont Self-Storage, Unit Number 7, contents unknown, Helen's things, Helen's junk, according to Richard, who had inherited his father's ability to dismiss anything that could not be monetized or displayed or traded for status. But Helen had not raised Richard to be this way. Helen had raised him with the values of the mountains, that you kept what mattered, and you honored your commitments, and you did not throw away the handmade gifts of the people you loved. Somewhere along the way, Richard had rejected those values entirely. He had become sleek and smooth and modern, a man who understood interest rates and capital gains, but not grace. Margaret had loved him anyway, for 35 years, believing that her devotion might somehow preserve the good parts of him, that her constancy might be enough. She had given up her research, her career, her singular path, and had woven herself into the tapestry of his life so thoroughly that she had forgotten she existed apart from him. His victories had been her victories. His comfort had been her purpose. His happiness had been the only North Star she followed, and then he had decided he wanted different things, and everything she had given up had evaporated into the air like water, leaving no trace, no mark, nothing to show that it had ever existed. Margaret took the key from the table. She would visit the storage unit tomorrow. She would drive out to Ridgemont on the highway that curved around the town where she had raised her children and hosted her dinners and played her role. She would open Unit 7, and she would see what Helen had saved, what Helen had deemed important enough to rent space for, to pay for all these years. Tonight she would sit alone in this small apartment, in this life that felt like a dress that did not fit, and she would remember a Wednesday 14 years ago when she had sat with Helen in a hospice bed, and Helen's papery hand had gripped hers with surprising strength. "I put everything that matters in a safe place, Margaret," Helen had whispered. Her voice had been threaded through with morphine and distance. "You'll know when it's time. You'll know what to do." Margaret had assumed it was the rambling of a dying woman, the mind casting about for metaphors and meanings. She had patted Helen's hand and brought her water and rearranged the quilts Helen had made over 60 years, quilts that Richard had never displayed, had never valued, had left to languish in a storage unit like forgotten prisoners. Now, Sitting in her rented apartment with her pension and her suitcase and her one small key, Margaret understood something had shifted. Richard had dismissed the storage unit as worthless junk, a burden, something to be disposed of when it became inconvenient. But what if Helen's gift was not the things themselves but the act of preservation? What if Helen, who had loved Margaret with the quiet certainty of someone who recognized a kindred spirit, had left her something that Richard could not value because he had never learned to see her as having value at all? The saxophone music continued from the apartment across the hall, halting and uncertain, finding its way note by note. Margaret sat in the dark and listened, and for the first time since the divorce was filed, she felt something other than shame or regret or the hollow ache of displacement. She felt the smallest, most fragile bloom of curiosity. Tomorrow she would go to Ridgemont Self-Storage. Tomorrow she would open the door to Helen's gift. But tonight she sat in the dark with the key in her hand, and she allowed herself to imagine that Helen had saved something important, something that had been waiting all these years for Margaret to be ready to receive it. She allowed herself to imagine that her life, the one she had given away so freely, might not be over yet. Margaret sat on the edge of her bed in the apartment that still didn't quite feel like home, holding the small brass key between her thumb and forefinger. It was Tuesday morning, the kind of autumn morning when the light comes in sideways through the windows and makes everything look like it's from another era. She had been staring at that key for 3 days now, ever since she'd found the birthday card. She'd been sorting through her mother's brown leather suitcase, the one she'd dragged from the marriage like a reluctant witness to her own life, when the card had slipped out from between 2 faded photograph envelopes. "Happy 60th birthday, Margaret." The handwriting was Helen's, that careful Appalachian cursive that moved across the page like a gentle hand. Inside, Helen had written, "I put everything that matters in a safe place, Margaret. You'll know when it's time." The card was dated 14 years ago, sent to Margaret's old address, the house she'd shared with Richard. Margaret had never received it. Helen must have asked Richard to give it to her. He never had. Margaret traced her thumb over the worn edges of the card, remembering Helen's voice, not the voice of the woman dying in that hospital bed at 78, thin and gray as old paper, but the Helen of 30 years before, the woman who sat in the kitchen quilting frame with her silver thimble, humming old ballads while her needle pulled thread through cloth like she was writing the story of her own hands. She'd kept the card in the suitcase all these years without knowing why. Now, sitting on the bed of her studio apartment with its rented furniture and its walls that belonged to nobody, she understood. Helen had been speaking across time, had been laying a trail of breadcrumbs through the wilderness of Margaret's life. "I put everything that matters in a safe place." Margaret set the card on the nightstand and picked up the key again. Ridgemont Self-Storage, Unit 7. A small tag was attached to the key ring, faded now, but Helen's handwriting was unmistakable. She'd written the unit number in blue ballpoint pen, the kind that came with a Bic logo on the side, the kind Helen had kept by the telephone in her kitchen for 35 years. Margaret stood. She wasn't a woman given to sudden decisions anymore. At 71, she'd learned that life moved in careful increments, that you didn't leap toward things, you inched toward them, testing the ground as you went. But something in her chest had shifted when she found that card. Something that had been sleeping began to open its eyes. She packed the brown leather suitcase with a few changes of clothes and her cardigan, the lavender one Helen had given her the last Christmas before she died. It had been almost white then, a pale cloud of wool. Now it had faded to something softer, something that looked like memory itself. Margaret folded it carefully, the way Helen had taught her, and laid it on top. She combed her silver-white hair into its usual soft bun. She found her tortoiseshell glasses on the nightstand and slipped them on. In the mirror, she barely recognized herself. When had she become this small thing? This quiet woman who existed apologetically in rented rooms, as if she was afraid she'd taken up too much space in the world just by being alive. Margaret locked the apartment behind her and walked to her car, a sensible 2015 Honda Civic. Purchased second-hand from a dealership run by a kind man who hadn't asked too many questions about why a woman her age was buying a car alone. The October sun was warm on her shoulders as she sat in the driver's seat, holding the key in one hand, watching the light move across the windshield. She pulled out of the parking lot and headed south toward Ridgemont, following the GPS on her phone like a woman following a map drawn by the dead. The drive took 40 minutes. Margaret drove through the kind of landscape that made her heart hurt. Rolling hills the color of amber and rust, farmland that had belonged to the same families for generations, two-lane highways lined with dogwood and hickory trees shedding their leaves like memories nobody wanted to keep anymore. She passed a white church with a steeple so thin it looked like it might blow away in the next strong wind. She passed a barn painted the color of dried blood, with a faded Coca-Cola advertisement from 1987 still visible on its side. She passed a small cemetery surrounded by a black iron fence where the maple trees were burning red against a sky so blue it didn't seem real. By the time she reached Ridgemont, the sun had begun its slow descent. The self-storage facility was exactly what Margaret expected. A collection of faded cinder block buildings arranged in neat rows, like a grid on a map of forgotten things. Corrugated metal doors, some orange with rust, some still holding their original shade of blue. A chain-link fence surrounded the property. The gravel lot was mostly empty, except for a few cars and an old pickup truck. A small office building sat at the entrance, painted the color of institutional beige. Margaret parked and walked toward the rows, the key in her hand. Unit 7. The buildings were labeled with faded white numbers. She walked slowly, reading each one as she passed. 4, 5, 6. There. 7. The padlock was the color of rust and time, thick and heavy, but when Margaret inserted Helen's key, it turned with a soft click that sounded like a secret being told. She unhooked the padlock and set it carefully on the ground. Her hands were shaking. She had expected to be afraid, but instead, she felt only a kind of reverence, as if she was walking into a church. Margaret gripped the bottom of the metal door and pulled. It rolled upward on its track with a groan that echoed across the parking lot. The door lifted. The unit opened. And Margaret's breath caught in her throat. It was not a storage unit. It was a cathedral. The space was not large, maybe 10 by 15 feet, but every inch of it had been organized with an intention so careful and tender it brought tears to Margaret's eyes immediately. This was not a forgotten collection. This was a life's work. The dominant features were cedar chests, dozens of them stacked carefully in neat rows. Beautiful wood chests, some painted in soft colors, pale blue, dusty rose, ivory. Others left natural, the grain of the wood still visible and warm. They were arranged with almost mathematical precision, creating paths and aisles through the interior. Above and beside them hung wooden shelves holding bundles wrapped in acid-free tissue paper, each bundle tied with cotton string. On the floor, arranged in careful rows, these were wooden crates marked with dates in Helen's handwriting: 1982, 1985, 1989, 1995, 2002, 2010. spanning 4 decades. 4 decades of collected, curated, preserved things. The air inside was cool and dry. There was no musty smell. Instead, Margaret detected the faint scent of cedar and something floral. Lavender sachets hung from the ceiling on narrow shelves, still fragrant after who knew how many years. Someone, Helen, had been preserving something here. Someone had visited this place regularly, had maintained it, had kept it perfect. Margaret stepped inside slowly, as if moving through water. She reached out and touched the nearest cedar chest. The wood was smooth and cool beneath her palm. She opened it. Inside, arranged on shelves within the chest, were quilts. But not the quilts Margaret had expected. Not everyday quilts that might have been made with the leftover scraps of Helen's kitchen sewing projects. These were extraordinary quilts, the kind Margaret had only ever seen in museums or in the pages of books about Appalachian folk art, the kind that belonged behind glass, protected and honored. The first quilt Margaret lifted was a log cabin pattern made from silk and velvet scraps that glimmered in the dim light of the storage unit. The colors were rich, deep burgundy, forest green, cream, navy blue, and the pieces had been sewn together with stitches so small and regular they seemed almost impossible to have been made by human hands. There was a small tag pinned to one corner, Helen's writing in her careful script, "Log Cabin, Silk Velvet Crazy Quilt, circa 1870s Kentucky." Margaret set that quilt down gently and reached for another. This one was a bear paw pattern, the traditional Appalachian pattern that Margaret had seen her own grandmother attempt years ago, before her hands had become too stiff for the work. The colors had faded to the soft pastels of things that had lived long lives: pale pink, cream, dusty blue, a lavender that had faded almost to white. The tag read, "Bear Paw, Hand Quilted, circa 1890s, Harlan County, Kentucky." Margaret opened the next chest, and the next. Each one held quilts, beautiful museum-quality quilts that represented not decades of Helen's own work, but rather Helen's decades of collecting, preserving, honoring the work of the quilters who had come before. Double wedding rings with intricate stitching. Sampler quilts with dozens of different patterns all sewn into one coherent whole. A quilt made from flour sack fabric, the kind that had been printed with tiny designs in the Depression era. A cathedral window quilt with hundreds of small pieces arranged to create the illusion of stained glass. A postage stamp quilt made from scraps so tiny Margaret wondered how anyone had managed to sew them at all. Each quilt had a tag. Each tag held Helen's handwriting, Helen's knowledge, Helen's memory of where the quilt had come from, when it had been made, what pattern it was, what materials had been used. Some tags held longer notes. Purchased from Ruth Kidd's estate sale, 1998. Ruth learned to quilt from her grandmother in the 1930s. Her daughter gave me this when they were clear in the house. Another read, made by an unknown quilter, circa 1920s. Belonged to the Jenkins family in Letcher County. This pattern is traditional to the area. The stitching is the most beautiful I have ever seen. Margaret moved through the storage unit like someone moving through a dream. She opened chest after chest. The quilts inside represented not only Helen's love of quilting and quilters, but her dedication to preserving the work of generations of women whose names had mostly been forgotten. Women who had stitched their souls into cloth, who had created beauty with their hands in kitchens and front rooms and quilting circles while raising children and maintaining homes and enduring lives that were beautiful and hard in equal measure. Helen had preserved them. Helen had found them at estate sales and antique markets. Inherited from distant relatives and neighbors who were clearing out their homes. Helen had brought them to this storage unit. Helen had wrapped them carefully in acid-free tissue paper. Helen had written down everything she knew about them. Helen had tended to them like they were holy things, because Helen had understood that they were. Margaret found a wooden bench, small, painted pale blue, set against one wall of the unit, facing the rows of chests. Someone had sat here. Helen had sat here. Helen had come to this storage unit, had opened these chests, had looked at these quilts, had touched the work of her ancestors and the women she'd known in her life, and had remembered them, had honored them, had kept them safe. Margaret sat down on the bench and wept. She wept for Helen, who had been dead for 14 years. She wept for the quilters whose names were on those tags, and for the ones whose names were lost forever. She wept for herself, for the years she had spent in a marriage to a man who had never really seen her, who had replaced her with someone younger and more convenient, who had left her with almost nothing except a key to a room full of everything that mattered. Helen had seen her. Helen had understood her. Helen had known that one day Margaret would need to walk into a place where she could see the work of women's hands, preserved and honored, and remember that her own life meant something, that her own work, 35 years of loving a man who didn't deserve it, of being a librarian who had helped countless people find the stories they needed to read, of learning to quilt at Helen's knee and creating her own small, beautiful things, meant something. Helen had put everything that matters in a safe place, and she had left Margaret with the key. Margaret pressed forward into the storage unit, her eyes adjusting to the deeper shadows where the overhead bulb's reach grew thin. The cedar scent grew stronger, almost medicinal, mingling with something else. The particular smell of old fabric, old time, old care. She moved past the open chests, their lids propped wide like mouths frozen mid-song, and her fingers trailed along the quilts still folded within them. Each one she touched seemed to hold weight beyond its actual mass, as though the hands that had stitched them had pressed their intention directly into the threads. Yes, a shaft of light caught the edge of something deeper in the shadows. Not quilts this time, but the corner of what looked like a piece of furniture. Margaret moved toward it, her sensible shoes crunching softly on the concrete floor. As she drew closer, the shape resolved itself into a workbench, substantial and purposeful, running along the back wall of the unit. This was no casual clearing table. This was a restoration station. Margaret's breath caught. The surface was fitted with 3 adjustable magnifying lamps, their gooseneck arms articulated at careful angles. Below, drawers had been labeled in Helen's precise handwriting. Needles by era. Threads organized not just by color, but by fiber content and approximate historical period. Each spool wound tight and cataloged. There were tweezers of varying sizes, specialized scissors with handles worn smooth from years of use, and a pin cushion made from faded blue gingham shaped like a small bird that Margaret recognized from her own mother's sewing basket decades ago. Beside these tools lay reference books, their spines creased from reading, American Quilts and Quilting, a comprehensive guide to patterns and history, the Underground Railroad in stitches, coded messages in quilts, textile conservation and care in the home collection. The margins were filled with Helen's careful notes in pencil, cross-references, dates, questions pursued. Margaret sank onto a wooden stool tucked beneath the bench, her knees suddenly uncertain. This was not a hobby. Hobbies did not inspire the purchase and curation of professional-grade magnifying equipment. Hobbies did not warrant this kind of systematic documentation, this meticulous organization. What Helen had built here was a restoration laboratory, a scholar's workshop, a temple to the preservation of women's work. She reached for one of the quilts stacked carefully beside the bench. a piece that had been laid out flat as if mid-restoration. The fabric was a deep indigo, printed with tiny cream-colored patterns, and as Margaret lifted it gently, she saw the careful stitching where Helen had reinforced a seam, replacing deteriorated thread with period-appropriate cotton in a shade that matched the original so closely that Margaret had to look twice to see the repair. The work was invisible in the way that true restoration always is, not meant to be seen, but meant to allow the original to be seen again. Behind the workbench, Margaret discovered something that stopped time for a moment, a bank of archival photograph albums, each spine labeled in gold lettering with dates and quilt names. She pulled one at random, Soldiers' Comforts and War Quilts, 1861 to 1865, and opened it carefully. Inside, Helen had documented each quilt from multiple angles. The full piece laid flat, close-ups of the quilting stitches, detailed photographs of the binding, shots of any embroidered or embellished areas. The handwriting beside each photograph was meticulous. Provenance notes, fiber content identifications, estimated creation dates, references to historical documentation. One quilt had a notation that made Margaret's heart skip. Name of soldier stitched into binding, confirmed to be Private James Hartwell, 47th Ohio Infantry, KIA Vicksburg, 1863. The original cotton batting still intact, never replaced. Margaret opened another album, Freedom Trail Quilts and Coded Messages, circa 1850 to 1870. Helen's notes alongside the photographs were even more detailed here, citing scholarly research, cross-referencing patterns with documented escape routes, and recording her own observations about the symbolic language woven into the designs. One quilt, a tumbling blocks pattern in rust and cream and deep forest green, included Helen's penciled note, "Scholars at the Textile Symposium, see saved article in reference folder, believe this pattern indicated safe houses on the northern routes through Tennessee. The progression of blocks may have been directional markers." Helen had preserved not just the quilts themselves, but the scholarly context that gave them meaning. Deeper in the unit, and Margaret found more chests and carefully labeled storage boxes, each one organized with a logic that spoke of years of methodical work. She opened one marked simply Helen's Tools, and there, nestled in acid-free tissue paper, was a collection of quilting implements that felt almost sacred to hold. Her needle cases, her thread scissors with bone handles worn silky by decades of use, and there, Margaret's eyes filled, her silver thimble, bearing the marks of a lifetime of tiny stitches. And beneath all of this, wrapped in more tissue paper, was a small pincushion Margaret herself had sewn and given to Helen 30 years ago, a clumsy thing made from faded calico with dried lavender stuffed inside. Helen had kept it all these years, not stored it away carelessly, but kept it, cherished it. Preserved it among the most precious items in her quilting life. Margaret held the pincushion against her chest, and that was when the full weight of Helen's intention became clear. This was not a collection. This was not even a restoration workshop. This was an archive, a carefully constructed repository of women's history, women's art, women's labor, women's hands. Every quilt documented, every restoration explained, every piece of context preserved, so that when someone, someday, somehow, came to understand what Helen had done, they would understand not just the individual quilts, but the entire narrative of women's work throughout American history. The Soldier's Comfort stitched with a man's name was a memorial to a woman's love. The Freedom Trail quilt was a coded message that had once guided human beings toward freedom. And Helen had spent years understanding its language. The quilts in the chests represented not leisure, but labor. Not decoration, but documentation. Not fashion, but the fierce act of preservation itself. Margaret stood slowly, turning in a slow circle in the storage unit, suddenly seeing it for what it truly was. A monument to the invisible work of women, the work that would have been thrown away, donated unsorted to a thrift shop, cut up for rags, lost forever if Helen had not decided that it mattered, if Helen had not decided that preserving it was worth the cost of a storage unit year after year, worth the meticulous documentation, worth the scholarly research, worth the careful, patient hands. She pressed her fingers to her glasses and took a long breath, understanding finally why Helen had locked these quilts away. Not in shame or secrecy, but in safekeeping. They were too valuable, too fragile, too important to be exposed to casual mishandling. They were waiting for someone who would understand their worth. And now, Margaret did. Her hands trembled as she lifted the first document from the base of the cedar chest. Cream-colored paper, professional letterhead, dated nearly 20 years prior. The words swam before her eyes at first, but then they crystallized. Certificate of Authenticity and Appraisal. The quilt described on the page, a pattern Margaret had seen only moments before, carefully wrapped in acid-free tissue, was valued at $47,000. $47,000 for a quilt. Margaret's breath caught in her throat, and she had to sit back on her heels, pressing her palms against her thighs to steady herself. There was another appraisal beneath it, and another, and another, each document a small shock to her system, each one describing textile pieces with meticulous detail, weaving techniques, dye sources, documented provenance, historical significance. One quilt, a Northampton County piece from 1847, was assessed at $73,000. A drunkard's path variant with Civil War-era fabric scraps in its alternating blocks was valued at $62,500. Margaret's mind couldn't seem to process the numbers. She had spent 35 years working in a public school library, checking out books at $5 a day, late fee. And here, in a climate-controlled storage unit in a town she'd never lived in, were quilts worth more than her annual salary times 5. She moved to the next cedar chest, her fingers now shaking visibly. Inside, nestled between the quilts and the walls, were leather-bound notebooks. The covers were soft with age, the pages inside filled with Helen's precise, careful handwriting. Margaret recognized that handwriting from the label makers, from holiday cards Helen had sent her over the years. Always brief, always kind, never presumptuous. Now, as she opened the first notebook, she saw Helen's meticulous records, estate sale locations, dates of acquisition, condition notes, conservation work performed, materials used, hours of labor. Some entries spanned multiple pages, detailing how Helen had carefully unpicked a damaged section of a 1920s crazy quilt, identified the original silk thread sources, and hand-stitched it back together using period-appropriate techniques. Margaret read dates that meant Helen had been doing this work for over 40 years. 40 years. That meant Helen had begun collecting and preserving these quilts when she was in her 30s, when Margaret had just met Richard, when Helen was still the quiet presence at holiday dinners, the woman who sat in the corner of rooms and seemed to disappear into herself. But Helen hadn't disappeared. Helen had been traveling to estate sales across 3 states, to auctions in small towns where old things were sold for nothing because no one understood their worth, to the mountains of eastern Kentucky, to Appalachian communities where women's handiwork, the accumulated legacy of generations, was being lost to time and neglect, and the simple fact that people didn't understand what they were looking at. The next section of documents made Margaret stop breathing. Letters. Formal, respectful letters from people with titles. Dr. Patricia Henning, textile historian, University of Virginia. Marcus Webb, curator of American Decorative Arts, Smithsonian Institution. Dr. Eleanor Chase, director of the Appalachian Heritage Museum. The letters were inquiries, expressions of professional interest, requests to see the collection, declarations that Helen's work was extraordinary, historically invaluable, among the most significant private collections of American textile heritage in the country. One letter, dated 12 years ago, read, "Dear Mrs. Holloway, I have been honored to follow your acquisitions and restorations for nearly a decade. Your eye for significant pieces and your dedication to preservation are truly exceptional. I would very much like to discuss the possibility of a major exhibition featuring your collection. Your work deserves to be seen and studied by scholars and the public alike." Margaret's vision blurred. Helen, quiet Helen, who had never raised her voice, who had served pot roast and said nothing when Richard complained about the food, who had mended Richard's shirts without asking for thanks. Helen had been building a legacy, a documented, professionally recognized, historically significant legacy. And Margaret was reading about it for the first time while her mother-in-law had been dead for 14 years. At the bottom of the fourth cedar chest, her fingers found something different. An envelope, heavy cream stock, her name written on it in Helen's handwriting, sealed with an old wax seal shaped like a thimble. "For Margaret, eat when the time comes." Margaret's hands shook so badly she could barely break the seal. The letter was dated 15 years ago, nearly a year before Helen died. "Dear Margaret," it began, "if you are reading this, I am gone, and you have discovered what I spent 40 years building. I hope you forgive me for keeping this secret, but you will understand why when you finish reading." Margaret read about Helen's observations, how Helen had watched Richard over the years, the small cruelties, the dismissals, the way he had never truly valued Margaret's quiet intelligence, her kindness to others, her gentle strength, how Helen knew that Richard's selfishness was not a temporary character flaw, but the central organizing principle of his life. How Helen understood, with the certainty of someone who had lived for many decades, that Margaret would be left with nothing if she was not prepared for it. "I have never spoken to you about this," Helen wrote, "because to do so would be to betray your private heart and your loyalty to Richard, and that would not be kind. But I see you, Margaret. I have always seen you, and I am building a protection for you, the way my mother taught me to build protection into quilts, patterns that hold meaning, layers that strengthen, traditions that carry the hands and hearts of women who came before." Margaret had to stop reading. She was crying now, sitting in the middle of a climate-controlled storage unit, surrounded by the labor of Helen's entire adult life, and crying as though her heart was breaking open for the first time in years. The letter continued. Helen explained the appraisals, the documentation, the insurance. She explained that she had paid for the storage unit through 2030, years of rent already paid in advance, a burden she had carried in the same way she carried everything, quietly, methodically, without complaint. "These quilts are worth a great deal of money," Helen wrote, "but they are worth infinitely more than that. Each one holds the hands of women, some whose names are lost, some whose daughters never knew their mother's skill. The quilts are a promise that those hands will not be forgotten. And they are also yours, Margaret, not just as an inheritance, but as a recognition of your own value, which is incalculable." Margaret continued reading with tears streaming down her face. Helen had written about the cottage, a small stone cottage in Harlan County, Kentucky, near where Helen had grown up. Helen had purchased it in Margaret's name 15 years ago, 3 years before she died. The deed was in this very chest. A neighbor had maintained it, paid in advance by Helen for a 10-year period, which meant Margaret had a place to go, a roof over her head that was entirely her own, that Richard could never take from her, because Helen had signed no wills, made no claims, simply put it in Margaret's name like a gift, like a whisper, like a promise that had been waiting all these years to be discovered. "You have been treated as though you were ordinary," Helen wrote in words that seemed to speak directly to Margaret's breaking heart, "but you have never been ordinary. You are the only person in this family who ever looked at me and saw a person. You are the only one who asked about my days, who thanked me for small things, who treated an old woman as though her interior life mattered. That is not ordinary, Margaret. That is beautiful. That is worthy of protection and care. I am leaving you these things, the quilts, the records, the cottage, not out of pity, but out of recognition. You are far more valuable than any man who could forget you." Margaret couldn't read anymore. She held the letter to her chest and rocked herself, sitting on the concrete floor of storage unit number 7, surrounded by the artifacts of a woman's devotion, surrounded by history and preservation, and 40 years of quiet, methodical love. She cried for Helen. She cried for herself. She cried for the life she had lived, thinking she was worthless, thinking that 35 years of loyalty meant nothing, thinking that she would be left with a used suitcase and a broken heart and nothing else. She cried until her tears stopped, until her breathing steadied, until she could think again. Then, slowly, carefully, she read the letter one more time. Then she began to look at the quilts with new eyes, not as valuable commodities, but as Helen's handwriting made manifest. Each piece was a sentence in Helen's language. Each carefully documented acquisition, each restoration, each note in Helen's notebooks was a word in a message Helen had been speaking for decades. You matter. You are safe. You are loved. You are not alone. Margaret's phone felt heavy in her pocket. She pulled it out with trembling fingers. The screen showed it was late afternoon. She had been in the storage unit for hours. She found Suzanne's number and pressed the call button before she could second-guess herself. Suzanne answered on the third ring. "Hi, Mom. Everything okay?" There was a weariness in her daughter's voice, the tone of someone expecting to manage a problem. "I'm at the storage unit," Margaret said. Her own voice sounded strange to her, steadier than she felt. "Suzanne, I need you to sit down. I need you to listen to me, and I need you to believe what I'm about to tell you." There was a pause. Then Suzanne said, "Okay, I'm sitting." Margaret told her daughter about the quilts, about the appraisals spanning 2 decades, about the museum curators and textile historians who had written to Helen about the meticulous records Helen had kept. She told her about the letters, about the cottage in Kentucky. She told her, voice shaking, about Helen's letter to her. She read passages of it aloud, and by the time she reached the part about being worthy of protection and care, Suzanne was crying too. "Oh my God," Suzanne whispered. "Oh, Mom, I had no idea. I never knew Grandma Helen was doing anything like that. She never told anyone. Did she tell you?" "She left me a letter," Margaret said. "She explains it all. She knew your father. She knew that she needed to protect me." Margaret paused, then added quietly, "She saw me, Suzanne. When no one else was looking, your grandmother saw me and loved me anyway." Suzanne cried harder. "I'm so sorry, Mom. I'm so sorry I wasn't there. I'm sorry I didn't fight harder for you. I'm sorry I was such a coward about everything with Dad." Margaret, who had been so angry at her daughter just days ago, felt something shift in her chest. "You're a good person," she told Suzanne. "You did the best you could with what you knew. And you're here now. I'm telling you now. And you're here." They talked for another hour. Margaret explained the quilts, the collection, the estimated value. She told Suzanne about the cottage. She said, "I need to hire a lawyer. I need to figure out what to do with this, and I want you to help me figure it out." "Of course," Suzanne said. "Of course I will. Mom, this is incredible. I don't even know what this is." But Helen was incredible. I never knew her like that, but clearly she was something extraordinary. When Margaret finally hung up the phone, the sun was setting outside the storage facility. The light coming through the small window was golden, warm like honey. She sat among the quilts, the accumulated work of Helen's devotion, the layers of protection Helen had sewn into Margaret's life, while Margaret had been too bruised and broken to notice. She reached out and touched one of the quilts, running her fingers over the intricate stitching, over the patterns Helen's hands had touched, over the history preserved in thread and cloth and color. For the first time in months, for the first time in years perhaps, Margaret felt something other than fear and defeat. She felt seen. She felt valued. She felt impossibly less alone. The storage unit, which had seemed like a tomb when she first opened its door, now felt like a cathedral. The quilts were not just artifacts, they were Helen's voice, speaking across the gap between death and life, saying what she had never said in person. "You are worth something. You are worth everything. You were never meant to be left with nothing, and you never will be." Margaret sat there as the light shifted and softened, surrounded by the women whose hands had made these quilts, by the woman whose hands had preserved them, by a legacy of love that had been building in silence, invisibly, across decades. And for the first time since Richard had told her he was leaving, Margaret allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, her story didn't end with abandonment. Maybe it was only beginning to transform into something else entirely. The weeks that followed Margaret's discovery unfolded like the careful unraveling of a quilt, each thread leading somewhere unexpected. She found herself returning to the storage unit almost every other day, drawn back by something she couldn't quite name. At first, she told herself it was inventory, organization, the practical work of cataloging. But the truth was simpler and more terrifying. Margaret was finally getting to know her mother-in-law. She began arriving earlier each time, before the heat of the day made the metal building insufferable. The storage unit had its own smell now, not the sharp chemical tang of new plastic and cardboard she'd noticed on that first visit, but something more complex. Dust and aged cotton, the faint herbaceous undertone of lavender sachets tucked between the quilts. Something almost like memory itself, if memory could be bottled and preserved. She would switch on the fluorescent lights, harsh against the morning dimness, and move through the rows of shelves like a librarian in her own private archive. The notebooks became her daily ritual. Helen had left behind 7 of them. Leather-bound journals, with tissue-thin pages that whispered when Margaret turned them. She read them methodically, starting with the oldest, its cover cracked along the spine. The handwriting was precise, the slant consistent, the penmanship of someone who had learned to write in an era when such things mattered. Helen had documented everything, not just dates and names, but stories, entire lives, compressed into a few careful paragraphs. There was the entry about Lavone, a woman from a holler near Harlan, Kentucky, who had pieced a double wedding ring quilt entirely from scraps of fabric from her 5 daughters' wedding dresses. Helen had written about Lavone's hands, how they moved across the fabric with absolute certainty, how she had hummed while she worked, hymns mostly. Oh, and one folk song her grandmother had taught her 60 years before. Margaret read that Helen had spent 3 afternoons with Levon, sitting on her porch, watching those hands stitch, asking careful questions, understanding somehow that Levon needed to tell her story to someone who would truly listen. Then there was Bess, from West Virginia, who had made quilts as a form of prayer. Each one represented a year of her life, Helen wrote, the colors deepening as she aged, the stitches becoming more assured. The final quilt, the one now carefully preserved in the storage unit's climate-controlled piece, had been made the year Bess's husband died. It was darker than the others, shot through with flashes of gold. Helen had written, "She said she couldn't stop stitching. Her hands needed to grieve with needle and thread. I think she left part of her soul in that quilt, and I think she did it on purpose." Margaret began to see what Helen had been doing. This wasn't about collecting quilts, the way one might collect stamps or coins. Helen had been performing an act of preservation that went far deeper. She was preserving stories. She was documenting the invisible labor of mountain women whose names would never appear in art history books. She was honoring the knowledge that lived in their hands, in the patterns their mothers and grandmothers had taught them. She was saying, across the years, your life mattered. Your work mattered. Let me write it down so someone will remember. And Margaret, sitting on a metal folding chair in the middle of the storage unit with Helen's notebook open across her lap, understood this with the clarity of revelation. And this was what she had done in her library, wasn't it? Every bookmark she'd placed in the right child's hands. Every book recommended to a reluctant reader who needed to know they weren't alone. Every story preserved on a shelf where someone who needed it might find it. She and Helen had been doing the same sacred work, just in different mediums. The thought struck her with such force that she had to put down the notebook. She sat very still, feeling the cool concrete beneath her feet, hearing the distant hum of the building's air conditioning unit. 71 years old, and she had finally found her family. Not in the man she'd married or the son who had taken his father's side, but in the woman she'd barely known, who had died when Margaret was still young enough to believe she had her whole life figured out. Her phone rang on a Thursday afternoon, 3 weeks after that first sunset among the quilts. Margaret was in the storage unit, carefully photographing the details of a particularly intricate Dresden plate quilt. She almost didn't answer. The unknown number on the caller ID meant nothing, but something made her swipe to accept. It was Richard. The shock of hearing his voice, older now, rougher, nothing like she remembered, made her lose her breath for a moment. They hadn't spoken in 3 years. Not since the final custody documents were signed and the house was sold. He didn't bother with greeting or small talk. "I know what you're doing," he said. "Derek heard from his lawyer. My mother's estate. You have no right to those things, Margaret. Those quilts belong to my family. My family's legacy. You need to give me access to that storage unit immediately, or I'll be forced to involve lawyers." Margaret found herself looking at the quilt in front of her. Levon's double wedding ring. 5 daughters' wedding dresses transformed into something that had outlasted all of them. She thought about Helen's hands traveling across America, collecting these stories. She thought about Levon sitting on her porch, humming hymns while she stitched. "No," Margaret said. The word surprised her with its steadiness. "What do you mean, no? You don't understand the legal implications." "I said no, Richard. I'm not giving you access to the storage unit. Helen's work is going to be preserved. These quilts are going to be documented and kept safe. You can involve whichever lawyers you want." There was silence on the line. 35 years of marriage had taught her to expect him to raise his voice now, to threaten, to find a way to make her comply. But Margaret had changed in the weeks since she found the quilts. Something about standing in a room full of other women's stories had given her a kind of permission to be unmovable, to say no and mean it. "I'm hanging up now," Margaret said quietly. "Don't call me again." She pressed the red button before he could respond. Her hands were shaken, but not from fear, from something else entirely, something that felt, surprisingly, like freedom. The morning after Margaret called her daughter, the phone rang before dawn. It was Suzanne, her voice steady and certain. "Mom, I'm coming to you. We're going to fix this." Within 3 days, the two women sat across from a textile conservator in Louisville, a woman named Dr. Patricia Chen, who had spent 40 years authenticating quilts for the Smithsonian. Margaret laid out each piece carefully, watching Dr. Chen's eyes widen behind her magnifying lens. "These are extraordinary," she whispered. "Do you understand what you have here?" Margaret shook her head. She didn't need to. The way Dr. Chen touched the fabric, with reverence, with tears, told her everything. The authentication took 6 weeks. When the final report came back, the number seemed to belong to someone else's life. $2.3 million. But more than the monetary value was what the report said about Helen's quilts. Each piece was a masterwork, museum quality, historically significant, made with techniques that were becoming lost. 3 of the quilts had been exhibited in regional shows in the 1970s. One had won a blue ribbon at the Kentucky State Fair in 1986. Helen had never told anyone. She had simply kept making them, kept stitching, kept building this invisible legacy. The lawyer Margaret hired, a woman named Judith Kramer from Cincinnati with a specialty in textile collections and inheritance law, was the opposite of Caldwell in every way. She moved quickly and strategically. "These documents are airtight," Judith said, spreading Helen's papers across her desk. The storage unit was never part of the marital property inventory. It was transferred directly to you by Helen before the will was even filed. The cottage deed is dated 15 years ago, long before the divorce. Richard has no legal claim to any of it. When Richard's team tried anyway, he's sending letters that were thick with threats and legal language. Judith responded with quiet, devastating precision. Within 2 weeks, they stopped writing. Margaret and Suzanne made a decision together. Rather than sell the quilts, they would partner with museums. The Smithsonian wanted 3 pieces for permanent exhibition. The Kentucky Arts and Crafts Foundation wanted to create a full Helen Holloway retrospective. The Appalachian Museum in Charleston was interested in a traveling exhibition. Margaret would oversee conservation, arrangement, and education. At 71 years old, she was offered a position as a consultant, the thing she had always wanted to be. But the greatest gift came from something no museum could have offered. Helen's cottage in Harlan County had been sitting empty for years, not neglected, but waiting. So Margaret drove there on a cool morning in May, and when she stepped through the blue front door, she found that Helen had thought of everything. There was a quilting room on the 2nd floor, its walls lined with built-in shelves, its large windows facing east toward the mountains. There was a garden, overgrown but not wild, ready to be tended. There was a kitchen with a view of the valleys and a small bedroom with pale yellow walls. There was a wood-burning stove and shelves full of quilting books and a collection of thread organized by color in ways that made Margaret's heart ache with recognition. Helen had built this cottage as a sanctuary, and then she had left it to Margaret with the same quiet certainty that she had left the quilts. The moving day was simple. Margaret owned so little that mattered: a few boxes of books, and some clothes, her mother's china that Richard hadn't wanted. Her brown leather suitcase with the brass clasps went with her, though she no longer needed to carry her whole life inside it. When Richard heard about the cottage, about Helen's collection, about the museums and the money, and the fact that his ex-wife now had security he could never take from her, he called their son Derek. Derek called his mother. The conversation was cold, filled with accusations about greed and betrayal. Margaret listened quietly, and then hung up. Some bridges, once burned, were meant to stay that way. On the first morning in the cottage, Margaret woke early and lay in Helen's pale yellow bedroom, listening to the birds. She could hear the creek that ran through the property, and the wind in the pines, and the absolute silence of a life no longer defined by someone else's anger. She rose and made tea in Helen's kitchen, the one with the view of the valleys. She draped one of Helen's quilts, a piece made in 1978, with intricate log cabin patterns in jewel tones, across her lap. She thought about the woman who had stitched it all those years ago, working by lamplight, patient and skilled. She thought about Helen, who had stitched it into her collection, who had chosen Margaret to protect it. She thought about the love that was sewn into every thread, not the romantic love that had failed her, but something deeper, the love between women, the love that endured. Margaret understood, sitting in that morning light with the quilt warm in her legs and the mountains visible through the window, that she was part of that tradition now. She was not wealthy in the way Richard understood wealth, flashy and brittle and dependent on vanity. She was wealthy in something far more solid. She had a home that was hers. She had purpose that would outlive her. She had a garden to tend and quilts to preserve, and the respect of museums and the gratitude of historians. She had peace, and that morning, as she sipped her tea and felt the weight of Helen's quilts in her hands, she finally understood what Helen had known all along, that this kind of security was worth far more than anything that could be taken away. The brown leather suitcase sat by the blue front door, its work complete. Margaret would not need it anymore. She had arrived home.